Is it year long? You can actually send it for a second. How are things going? Good. Yeah. We're coming out actually next week. Yeah. It's exciting. Crazy. That's a good metaphor. Yeah, lots of stuff going on. Yeah. She is, she's got so much going on. Yeah, so like, and she's back that. Can't she practice yet? We're actually right now, or is she back in Texas?
No, she's in Bangladesh. What happened was that our routine contracting was delayed, isn't that so? That never happened. And so we did, and it actually was so threatening that I said, I'm not confident that she's going to resolve. So I didn't do it. We still have it, but I don't know.
Okay. I was good.
So she's now concerts are.
She was going to try to watch her December, so I told her we were going to count her to watch her, so she promised to party.
Yeah, she was disappointed, but it just with all of this, she was not able to put the ink work that she wanted this summer. So she's but she's I mean, it's actually gratifying to be.
So we have to change that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say that I, with this, gracious, I thought it was like that. I don't know, it was like, I definitely thought, we already forgot to take it. So I was like, but I'm completely compensated. But maybe it's yeah. With my like,
All right, one more minute.
people are definitely spending more.
On the technology. You need to bring the release. It's everywhere. It's happening everywhere. People buying just full
So you're very close right now with the standard?
Other people use it, that's, you know, what they do. But yes, really something there. Sticking up with
Yeah, we tried to work with the students, but
Yeah, there is one with that to do development.
I mean, this is just.
Yeah. Yes. You got it, yeah.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Peter Glick. I'm the co-founder and former director of the Pacific Institute in Oakland, California, which is a research and policy group focused on global freshwater challenges. Welcome to the freshwater breakout. I appreciate the organizers' willingness and enthusiasm about holding a session on water, although I'm trying to encourage them to make it a plenary and to figure out a way to bring in more of the conversation about fresh water, which of course is fundamentally related to both individual health and community health and planetary health. And perhaps next year in Sao Paulo, we will see more of that. So our session this morning is about the global freshwater crisis and particularly about solutions. And what I'm going to describe, I'm going to give a short introduction to what I think is the nature of the global freshwater problem, and then I'll describe what we're going to try and do in this session as we move forward. And I will introduce the participants at that point. But as background to freshwater challenges, and maybe this audience doesn't need this, although I think much of the broader audience does, let me describe the nature of what I think of as the freshwater challenge, and then I'll introduce the speakers and what we're going to be doing. I think there is a global freshwater crisis. I think there are a lot of different pieces of that crisis, all of which one could argue are to some degree related to individual or community or planetary health. There is the problem of our failure to meet basic human needs for fresh water and sanitation. This is in many ways the biggest and, in my opinion, the most inexcusable part of the freshwater problem. It's the 21st century, and we have failed to meet basic human needs for safe water and sanitation for hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people on the planet. And that by itself is a crisis, and that by itself contributes to the issue of health. We know that the failure to meet basic needs for water and sanitation lead to all sorts of things, but in particular, water-related diseases, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, guinea worm, schistosomiasis, that kill probably 2 million people a year, mostly children under the age of 5, and contribute to hundreds of millions of cases each year of preventable freshwater diseases, water-related diseases. We know that there is an ecosystem part of the global challenge, that many, if not most, of the freshwater ecosystem problems that we see are related to the way humans take fresh water out of the system. Damages to fisheries, damages to wetlands and natural ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, and so on. So the ecosystem challenge is in many ways fundamentally, a freshwater resource issue. We know that the challenge associated with food production is a freshwater problem. 80% of the water that humans take out of the system goes to grow food. We had a conversation yesterday and this morning a little bit about the issue of diets and agriculture. There was a presentation from Impossible Meats, about their effort to reduce the pressure on meat production and land and water and all sorts of components of the agricultural system by shifting away from traditional animal meats toward plant-based proteins in other forms. And that's a critical part of the conversation about water as well. We know that there's a water quality problem, both industrial wastes, human wastes, untreated or poorly treated wastewater that we collect, treat, and then put back in the environment. And so water quality is a critical piece of the global water challenge. We also know that there's more on the political side, tensions over access to water resources. At the Pacific Institute, we do a lot of work on conflict over water resources. We maintain something called the Water Conflict Chronology, which is an open source database that goes back literally 4,500 years, looking at the history of conflicts over water resources, violence associated with water resources, where water is a trigger of conflict, water is a weapon used during conflicts that start for other reasons. Water is a casualty of conflict. Again, conflicts that may start for other reasons. And Marshall Burke today in his 3-minute presentation talked about the connections between climate and conflict and rising temperatures and conflict. he didn't explicitly talk about water, but water is a critical piece of this. We are seeing a great increase in violence associated with water resources, independent of climate change and tied to climate change. And again, the Institute's done some work on Syria and the Middle East and conflict, but that is a piece of this puzzle. And finally, of course, explicitly, climate change. Climate change is a water problem. The hydrologic cycle is fundamental to the climate cycle. And as the climate changes, and again, this is a core focus of work we've done at the Institute, as the climate is changing and continues to change, we'll see rising temperatures and increases in pressure on water resources because of demand, changes in precipitation patterns and snowfall and snowmelt dynamics in the Himalayas and the Sierra Nevada and the Andes and the Alps, which is fundamental to water supply for many of the world's people. Changes in extreme events, floods and droughts, all of these are climate issues, all of these are water-related issues, and all of them ultimately tie back to planetary health and individual health. So that's, I mean, every one of these could be an individual discussion. Every one of these could be a plenary talk. Every one of these could be a broader conversation about the nature of the crisis. But we're also here specifically to talk about solutions because I believe, and I know the speakers we're going to hear from believe, we can move to a more sustainable water future that reduces the risks of all of these pieces of the puzzle. And so the structure of our conversation this morning is 3 core talks about engineering and technology solutions in the urban sector, about what I've described as soft path solutions focused on demand management and economics and the way we develop and design and restructure our institutions for the 21st century. And of course, fundamentally, how ecosystems play into all of these conversations, how they've been excluded in the past and how they need to be discussed, not separately, but as a core part of the way we think about water. What we were going to do is have these 3 talks for about 10 minutes each, and then break up into conversations separately. I'm not sure we have enough people to do that. I'm not sure if other people will trickle in, but at the end of the 3 talks, I'm going to come back and make a decision about whether we need to break into 3 groups or whether we can have a conversation sort of together about how to move these ideas about solutions that we're going to hear about into the actual policy arena. What are the regulatory approaches, the economic approaches, the management approaches to move solutions from the ideas phase into the actual implementation phase? So let me introduce the 3 speakers. The first is Richard Luthi, Dick Luthi, who's here at Stanford. He's the Palmer Professor of Civil Engineering. He was the former head of the National Research Council's Water Science and Technology Board, and I worked with Dick then. He's also the current director, I believe is the proper way to describe it, of the Renew It program, which is a nationwide but focused here in Stanford discussion about rethinking urban water infrastructure for the 21st century. That will be followed, and he's going to talk about water supply, water engineering in the urban context, and maybe a little more broadly, because I know Dick thinks more broadly than that. He's going to be followed by my colleague and friend Heather Cooley, who is the Director of Research at the Pacific Institute, has worked with the Institute since 2004, I think, has previously done work at Lawrence Berkeley Lab on climate change and soil carbon issues, but really at the Institute is focused on, I wouldn't say focus because she's looked at everything from water efficiency, demand management, the way we do demand forecasting, led the work that we've done on water and energy integration, a whole series of other pieces of the puzzle, has been on the board of the California Council on Water Conservation Council, and continues to do a lot of work with the state of California, but has also worked internationally. Followed by Marta Echeverria. Marta is a leading thinker and spokesman about the fundamental role of ecosystems in the way we think about water. She talks about design, development of financial tools, institutional mechanisms for integrating ecosystems in our thinking. She's worked throughout Central and Latin America, and Colombia and Ecuador and Guatemala and Peru. And we'll talk about, and is the director of Eco Decision now, and we'll talk about ecosystems. And then I have to mention, she's not up here, but she did this slide, so it's her fault. Lisa Mandel, who's a research associate here with the Natural Capital Group and with the Woods School, the Woods Institute for the Environment. And she's not going to give a formal talk, but I'm hoping we'll synthesize. She's going to take notes at the end. She's going to present the synthesis tomorrow, or later after lunch. So it's going to ruin her lunch, but she's going to have to turn what we talk about here today into something coherent. And she works on tools for measuring and monitoring and valuing ecosystem services. And was a very important person for helping bring this whole session together. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask Dick to come up and give his talk.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
So I'm not sure how we get to Dick's slides. But.
Oh, I can, yeah.
What were the names of the slide?
Well, it's Lucy, yeah, it's right, right here. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. All right, again, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for that kind introduction, Peter. So what I'd like to talk about is the ways in which we're envisioning more sustainable water supplies for urban areas in the West, particularly California. And I'll describe some work that we're doing in our engineering research center that's supported by the National Science Foundation and a large group of utilities. Essentially all the major water utilities in California are partners with us. I wanted to point out how things are changing in the urban water space. And this is a directive from Governor Newsom that came out just a couple of months ago, where he directs the state agencies to prepare more resilience for their water supply portfolios. And some of the words that he used here were prioritize multi-benefit approaches, embrace innovation and new technologies, and encourage regional approaches. And that's exactly what we're doing. California, I think, has been blessed in the sense that Governor Jerry Brown and now Governor Newsom have paid a lot of attention to water and recognize that we need to change the ways that we do business in that sector. So when we think about a diversified water supply portfolio, there isn't one option. Rather, we're going to do lots of things. And I sort of give a schematic here. We'll look at water reuse in more and different ways, both potable and non-potable. We see greater attention to conservation. Desalination plays a role for certain cities, San Diego notably. Stormwater harvesting, that's an opportunity we haven't embraced before. Water banking is something important in California because we can take advantage of our big infrastructure system in that area. So these are ways in which we can diversify our portfolio. And what I'll talk on just briefly here are systems for reuse and also the idea of capturing stormwater for water supply. So as a sort of a motivator here, I want to go back again to something earlier this year. Mayor Garcetti here in Los Angeles, he says the city will recycle 100% of its water by 2035. Now, I don't know if they'll actually meet this goal, but what's interesting is that this plant here, this is the Hyperion plant in LA, it processes close to 200 million gallons a day. So if you can recycle a large part of that, the idea is that this could provide about a third of the city's water. I'll talk also about stormwater capture, which is an opportunity. If you capture stormwater for the city, you can meet about a quarter of the city's future water needs. So with those two, water recycle and stormwater, you'll meet half the city's current demand. And what does that mean? That means you can reduce your reliance on imported water by half. So you can also see the soundbite here, a major step to reduce the reliance on imported water. In other words, looking to the future to see how can we make do with the water we have. So this is an example of centralized water reclamation. Now, there'll be some decentralized water reclamation, but when you talk about 150 to 190 million gallons a day, this will be where most of it will take place. But there is a role for decentralized water reclamation. And here's a picture of a test facility at Stanford. This is a facility that's set up just about a quarter mile that way, not very far. And we're evaluating how we can use new technologies to reclaim our water here at a place where it's generated and needed. And this avoids pumping water backwards from a centralized plant. Also, the water we have here is lower in salt than water from a centralized facility. And when you think this way, there's an opportunity to do things differently, explore new technologies that are energy efficient and very compact. And so we're demonstrating this at a pilot system here. And if successful, what we envision is that this would provide water for irrigation and then save our imported water, our Hetchechi water, for all the in-building use. So this is one scale. This is the scale of the campus. But another kind of decentralized operations that are coming into being are also for the tech campus. And this is a picture that I took about a week ago when I was visiting Facebook. Facebook's has large buildings. They have in their two big new buildings, they have 13 acres of roof gardens. Now this picture here is actually a roof garden. It's not an outdoor patio, it's on a roof. And that provides space for conversations and to get out of your cubicles and stuff like that and see the outdoors. And it makes a nicer working environment. So what's going on here is that Facebook is looking at how to recycle about 16 million gallons a year. And essentially all that water will go to this irrigation. But this is a trend we're seeing now. This movement towards decentralized water reclamation, the places where you can have someone to kind of watch over the system. Google is moving this way. Apple's doing this. Salesforce Tower in San Francisco. These are examples of what's happening. And then in the area of stormwater, this is an article in ES&T that I wrote with some others talking about the opportunity for stormwater in the US and Australia. And here, the idea is to change our view on stormwater. For the coastal cities in California, we have separate stormwater sewer systems. They were all designed for flood control. And so nowadays, we look at that water going to the bay or the ocean, and we think, well, there's an opportunity here to capture and use that water. And this is water that is locally available, underutilized, and if we do it correctly, it will reduce dependence on imported water. We've been working with LA Department of Water and Power, Bureau of Sanitation and Public Works to see how we could implement stormwater capture for water supply in Los Angeles. And one of our field sites is in this what's called the Sun Valley neighborhood of Los Angeles. It's near the Burbank Airport. And this insert here shows where the city has bought a former sand and gravel pit. Basically, it's an urban blight. And you're taking a 50-acre site and converting that to a stormwater capture treatment facility. And also you see amenities like walking trails and parks, tot lots, play courts, and stuff like that. This is an area of the city that really doesn't have these kind of community amenities. So these are the part of the co-benefits that can go with stormwater capture. The other thing I want to highlight in this picture is that this area is heavily urbanized. You can see all the hardscape, and there's freeways and industrial activities and that sort of thing. So if you think about harvesting our stormwater and putting a lot of water in the ground, we need to pay attention to all the different contaminants that are in urban water. And we're looking at these organic compounds that are found at lower concentrations in urban runoff, they are persistent. And these particular ones are more water-soluble, more polar compounds or anionic compounds. And these are the ones that, in our mind, are more problematic. So what we're doing with the city is looking at ways in which we could test filters in the field. And these columns are set up in the field down in Los Angeles, in which we use different kind of media to remove organic compounds or complex metals, or even degrade some compounds if we use certain metal oxides and the like. So the idea here then is to make sure that if we are capturing, in this case, it would be about 900 acre-feet a year, big facility. How can we ensure that that water is clean before it percolates into the ground? Now, smaller scale systems in Los Angeles are these dry wells. And here's a picture of me standing by one and a couple of our postdocs there. And the way these work, you have a curb inset, that water flows down this little swale and then into an underground chamber. And these are test facilities here that, I created a wave there, didn't I? These are test facilities to see, you know, just in general, how they might perform. But these systems are really nothing more than holes in the ground. And so we're looking here at ways in which we could bring the dry wells into the 21st century, and by instrumenting them, putting in media to absorb contaminants, and maybe put in an advanced oxidation system as well. There are about 10 in this area that are just sort of more of a demonstration systems right now. But what the city would like to do would be to put hundreds of these in the San Fernando Valley. So here too then, as you deploy this, you want to make sure that you're not contaminating groundwater. Now to wrap up, I just wanted to mention about how do these projects come into being? How is it that the city would invest in these? And by the way, where you see this, on Laurel Canyon Boulevard, before they put these in, there were no sidewalks, there were no curbs. So when you look, I don't have time to go into that, but these before and after pictures are very dramatic. So co-benefits are so important here. And one I'm illustrating now is a large system that's going in near the Long Beach Airport. And here you're capturing runoff from about 2,000 acres and diverting it into this infiltration gallery. So when I visit there and I take a picture of the sign, what does the sign say? Does it say stormwater for water supply? No. It says, protect our beaches, city environment, better for all. And so I'll conclude with this idea that understanding the co-benefits for all of these systems are so important, and that understanding the co-benefits is what brings a coalition together. It's what gets the attention of elected officials, and it's what boards of agencies will respond to. I don't have to read this slide, but you can maybe get a feel from those slides that I just showed, all the different co-benefits that there are. It's hard to quantify them. We know they're real, but it's what inspires the public, and in my mind, it's what results in action. So I'll conclude with that, and Heather, maybe this slide will relate to some of your discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dick. Good.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here today. Sorry. Yeah, right. We're live, right. And we're being recorded. Okay. Thanks for being here today. I'm really delighted to talk about some of the work we've been doing and to talk about solutions. I think it can be sort of dizzying around thinking about the problems, but I hope you walk away with this seeing that there are a lot of really innovative opportunities and solutions, and a lot of good things are happening in various communities here in California and around the world. I'm going to talk a bit more about soft path strategies. And I think you'll see in all of these components are important and fit together. So I'm going to talk about, again, the soft path strategies, but recognizing, this touches on what Dick talked about as well, and what Martha will talk about So I want to talk a little bit about what was really the 20th century approach to water. And contrast that with where I think we need to go. 20th century was very much near exclusive reliance on supply side solutions. So it was building big dams and reservoirs, taking water from further and further afield, bringing it, digging wells and deeper in wells. So I'm very much focused on supply and really a limited types of supplies. And as we heard from Dick, again, there's alternatives there. There was really little concern for ecosystem needs. It was really about meeting human needs and not even about meeting all human needs, but certainly we gave little concern about ecosystems. The infrastructure that was built was massive. It was very much centralized. It was expensive. In many cases, it was federally subsidized as well. And so that, of course, skewed the economics and then led to inefficiency and waste and impacts on ecosystems. In terms of the thinking, it was very much siloed with water and wastewater and flood separated, and then even that separated from issues around health and energy. And an issue we obviously are facing now, when these things were designed and built, it was based on historic conditions. And so it's no longer really meeting our needs. I think we've recognized that old approach was beneficial. It brought many benefits, certainly not to everyone, and there were lots of costs and externalities. But we need new thinking to address some of these challenges, some old challenges, but also some new challenges when we think about climate change. I really sort of break these solutions into three areas, and I'll talk about each. I'll touch on them briefly here, and then I'll go into detail on a few of them. One is around rethinking demand. So again, in contrast to a supply side mindset, the idea of managing demand is essential. It looks at reducing waste and increasing efficiency and rethinking some of our economic priorities and choices. And again, I'll talk about this in more detail in subsequent slides. Another key component is rethinking supply. And we heard from Dick how to think about that. It's looking at alternatives. It's looking at stormwater and treated wastewater. It's thinking about decentralized systems to complement our centralized systems. And it's thinking about modular systems. So given the uncertainty that we are faced with, we've always had some amount of uncertainty, but I think we're operating in a much more uncertain world. So the idea of having modular systems that don't commit you as much as some of these large centralized, I think is another powerful piece. And finally, rethinking management, prioritizing basic human and ecosystem needs, as Peter sort of talked about, thinking about collaboration and inclusivity. I think people are recognizing we all need to work together. That's where the regional approaches start coming in. Thinking about more and better data to inform our decisions. Water data is notoriously sparse, and the data we have is often not good. And so as we think about responding to the challenges, we need to be collecting better data and integrating that into the decisions we're making. Another component is around economics, shifting away from this heavily subsidized to a more full cost pricing, though recognizing that not everyone is going to be able to afford that. And so we need to be sure that we're helping meet some of these basic needs for those that are unable to afford, and providing subsidies in those cases. And thinking about integrated systems, and I'll talk a bit more about that last one. So let's first talk about demand. There is this perspective, and I hear it all the time, that, well, as we grow, we need more water. And if we look at the past, in many places, we can see that we have been able to grow, have significant population growth in some areas while using the same amount or even less water. This shows an example from California. We're looking back from about 1960 at both population and our total water withdrawals. And as you can see, from the left here in population has grown dramatically. It's more than doubled, 2.5 times during this period. And yet we're using about the same amount of water. So, showing that we can and have decoupled both population growth and water use. We can also look at decoupling economic growth and water use. Again, the perception is we need more water. But here showing gross state product with water withdrawals, and you can see, and all of these are in real dollars. So as you can see, our economy has grown dramatically over this time period, and our water use has still remained relatively constant. Unless you think that this is a California phenomena, it is much broader. This is showing national data, showing population growth. This actually goes back to 1900. And you can see up until about 1970, late 1970, 1980, we actually did see where water use grew as population grew. But starting in about 1980, we saw that decoupling start, where water use flatlined and has now been going down. And the drivers in all of these cases have been a combination of efficiency, driven both by standards and codes, driven by, in some cases particularly for industry, wastewater standards and requirements, but it also represents and reflects a shift in our economic priorities and choices. So we have moved away from more manufacturing, shifted towards more service-oriented, which is a less water-intensive types of industry. Here also showing GDP, US GDP, and water withdrawals. And again, very similar trends as you see in California. So this isn't an isolated phenomena. You see this in many communities. And I think the good news is more can and must be done. We know that we're still faced with challenges. Just keeping water use flat has not been adequate. We know we're already taking too much from ecosystems. We're not meeting basic needs. So we need to be doing more, but we can do more. And there are a lot of different ways. I show a couple of opportunities. Landscaping is a big one, particularly here in the Western US, where we put a lot of water on very water intensive lawns. And we can shift away to these low water use that are incredibly attractive. I think there's a perception, again, that these are sort of sticks and rocks, but it's come a long way. And there are many beautiful native plants, Mediterranean type plants that can help, increase the curb appeal. I know as many are concerned about, but they provide co-benefits, and I think Dick touched on these. It's reducing water use. It's creating urban habitat, right? Lawn is not a great habitat, but some of these other ones actually can attract birds and bees, other types of wildlife, depending on where you are, reducing energy use. So there's lots of different co-benefits and lots of reasons to be shifting. Appliances as well, many appliances indoors, in residents and in businesses that use far less water and in many cases less energy than what is currently in place. Agriculture has a number of efficiency opportunities, drip irrigation, et cetera. And finally, distribution system leaks. This is an issue in every community, but particularly you see in many developing countries where leaks can represent more than a third of water usage. And so a huge opportunity to be addressing that problem, saving water, saving energy, and meeting some of those basic needs, and even leaving water in rivers and streams and underground. I'll touch a little bit on the alternative supplies, although I think Dick touched on this quite a bit, but a lot of opportunity, and we're seeing lots of really interesting, innovative projects in both centralized and decentralized, and I think we have just scratched the surface on that. So I think a really exciting time in terms of this area as well. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about rethinking management. And I gave a number of examples early on, but I do want to talk about the piece around integration and the recognition that we need to be making more integrated and informed decisions. And part of that is better understanding what the co-benefits are of these projects. This is some work we've been doing at the Institute for about 18 months. We've been trying to develop a framework around the multiple benefits of water management and water projects. And this just gives you a sense of it. There are potential for water, both on the water quality, quantity, and flooding, but also energy, benefits to people and community, reducing risk and uncertainty, and of course, benefits to land and environment. And on top of this is the idea of equity, the need to look at the distribution of benefits among different stakeholders to try to rebalance how that has been. Obviously, there are groups that have been historically not benefiting from many of these water projects, and we need to remedy that. There are many, and I think, again, Dick touched on this, stormwater is a supply, it's a potential to improve water quality, it's a potential to provide community space, boost employee health and productivity in the place of the business. So lots of different, I think, again, opportunities there. So let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts. There are many challenges facing the water sector. Some are old, some like climate change are new and are exacerbating some of those older challenges. And our traditional water management system was really inadequate. It helped, but it created some of its own problems. And so we need a new, more sustainable and resilient approach based on rethinking demand, rethinking supply, and then rethinking the management. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Heather. And Mark.
No, so I think this is a great segue into my presentation because I'm going to take you upstream. You've been in the city, you're in an urban setting, and I'm going to take you to the rural area where your water comes from. So let me begin by thanking the organizers, and having the opportunity to be here is a real pleasure. It's also amazingly privileged. I just want to highlight that as a practitioner, I'm not really in such academic settings, and especially in these beautiful installations, and to think of the United States capacity in terms of the university system. For those of us in developing countries, we get, you know, amazed. So you should all realize how privileged we all are to be here and having this conversation today. So what I wanted to do is show you beautiful images, but as a way to entice you to think about where does your water come from. So I want to highlight that if I were to ask you that question and you were living in Quito, this is where your water would be coming from. It's 3 national parks that have glaciers, huge 5,000 to 6,000 meter glaciers. And below those glaciers, the glacial melt feed into huge grasslands, Andean grasslands and páramo, which have a gradient of humidity from the northern part of South America to the south. In Peru, they're called puna. In Bolivia, they're called yungas. They're different ecosystems that have very low vegetations, but have an incredible capacity to store water in the soils as well as in the vegetation. And what's been interesting that since you live in Quito is that from 2000, Quito decided to create a water trust fund where 1% of your rate, now it's 2% of your rate, goes into a special fiduciary trust that allows the money to be managed in an independent way and to be invested in the protection of these systems. And these images are highlighting some of the measures that have to be taken. Number one, these national parks were paper parks. Now they have very strong security and sort of guard systems so that we can prevent burns, which are becoming much more common with fires, out of control fires, also to prevent hunting, to prevent, illegal crossing, and also to begin to deal with the overgrazing that was happening in these areas. These areas were mostly used for cattle ranching, extensive cattle ranching, without any control, and then even in areas with sheep, which are highly damaging, affecting these systems. So the Water Trust Fund has been able to work in buying some of these areas. Right now it's 20,000 hectares that are managed by the Water Trust Fund. And in addition to that, focus conservation measures in the rest of the 150,000 hectares that feed and recharge the water for the city. And what's interesting is that this mechanism ensures a sustainability of the system. We think that by 2026, the water fund will be self-sustaining. They will have enough resources to be able to maintain the programs and be able to do everything that they want to do, including some of the monitoring that you're seeing, and the research is complemented with outside funding. So this is one scale of mechanism if you were living in Quito. But maybe there are other 19 to 38 cities throughout the world that do this kind of stuff. You also, if you were from Santa Cruz, Bolivia, in a small town, the scale of interventions might be much smaller. And it's basically an agreement between a local NGO, the city government or the town government, and the local landowner to come to an agreement in what they call reciprocal agreements, and basically to protect the place where your water is being funneled in to your little town. And what they do is pay those landowners with honeybee boxes and fruit trees so that they invest in protecting the forest and ensuring that they have some income instead of selling the wood. So this is a small scale little agreement that now Natura, the foundation, assumes and calculates that they are working at about, I think 33% of the municipalities in Bolivia. But if you were from Lima, you would be seeing something that we're very excited about, which is that out of a law in 2015, Lima and Peru is one of the first countries that is beginning to include in the drinking water rate an investment for the watershed. Lima is at 1%. But 38 of the 52 utilities in Peru now have some percentage of their water rate, which they negotiate every 5 years, that has to be invested in the watershed. The good news is that we have almost $80 million in the box, let's say, to be able to work with. The bad news is that since it's public money, the public expenditure and budgeting system in Peru, it is Kafkanian. So it's been very difficult to be able to spend the money. So only about $1.5 million has been able to be spent, but there's a lot of efforts from different organizations, ODA, and the government to begin to see how do we open that valve, how do we make these projects viable. And of course, you get here into the discussion is, do the civil engineers accept the soft path, the natural infrastructure measures, and do they question the cost effectiveness, the viability of these systems? So there is a larger question there in terms of how do we get these conversations going, and how do we get the Ministry of Finance to accept that these are serious investments, right? So the good news is that this is a trend, and I highlighted 3 cases at different scales with different volumes of resources, which are still tiny, 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 but at least we're talking bigger numbers. At a global scale, these sort of natural infrastructure mechanisms are now reaching $25 billion was the latest estimate, and it's been a growth over time. Latin America being sort of experimental ground for these mechanisms. Little money, maybe right now we're with Peru, we went up substantially, but what used to be maybe $20 million of investment, now we're up to 150 million. But ideally, we have many stories, many processes are underway and the good thing is that these things are being measured. Before there was a large question in the payment for watershed systems that, well, you're not really showing that you are providing a result. But we really can show the data is there, the evidence has been gathered, and there's enough experience to say, yes, we can improve regulation, which is ensuring that you have water in the dry periods. Yes, we can ensure that we can reduce sediments, which is a major cost for treatment in the urban settings. And yes, we can reduce risk and at least vulnerability to certain level of floods, and then also provide co-benefits or resilience for the moment where you manage those risks. The other thing that's been interesting is that we have shown that it is cost effective. The case of Quito, we just did a study that was really instrumental in getting the operations of the water company to understand why these green, butterfly and bird measures are interesting and serious and robust. And so the conclusion is that for every dollar that the water company was putting in the trust fund, it would get back 5. And that return on investment changed the conversation. The manager of the company, who was a big skeptic, now got awards at the World Water Forum. Now he, tells the story himself, and he's a believer. And he becomes a really instrumental champion for other skeptics to come on board. A recent study by the World Bank for Lima estimates that Lima's investment, which is a very complicated watershed just because it's a very tight and limited watershed in terms of its response, hydrological response, they have found that for every dollar that Lima would invest, it should get $3 to $6 of return on investment. So the numbers are interesting. The numbers are there. And we're saying, trying to continue to generate more evidence, because each ecosystem is a little bit different. Each context is a little bit different. But we truly believe that we're on a pathway of adoption, which I think it's taken off. What used to be small pioneer pilot experiences, I think there's a trend. We're mainstreaming something that is very interesting. And what I think is most interesting, and I think it was highlighted by the presentations before, is that it's allowing us to bring in the complementarity between the gray infrastructure and the green infrastructure. The green could provide a protection and a flexibility that your gray infrastructure might not have. And this is a conversation that I would love to explore more with all of you today, because I think there's a long ways to go. The siloed effect that we're talking about includes the world of conservation versus the world of engineering, civil engineering. Just in the water space, the world of the drinking water versus the hydroelectric plants versus the agriculture. We need to have these conversations across sectors to begin to think about how these systems can help each other, co-leverage each other, and have a much more sustainable management of water, as Heather highlighted. And what's been interesting is for you to think about is there's also something that we need to recognize. I wanted to highlight with the cases that I spoke about, which are ones where I have directly been involved, and that is that whatever we do and do not do in the Andes affects the Amazon. The Amazon, whatever we do and do not do for the Amazon affects the Andes. So the world has finally recognized that the Amazon is burning. It's been going on for a long time. And it's not only going on in Brazil. It's going on in Peru. It's going on in Bolivia. And we got nervous when Notre Dame fell down. We put $20 million when the Amazon was burning. So we really have to recognize that this ecosystem, which is the lung of the world, is vital to not only water management, to the viability of the cities, but to the viability of the whole region. So when we're talking about planetary health, I think there's a larger conversation about watersheds, right, and landscape management that gets us to really understand that we have the most incredible plants, industrial plants that nature has improved and developed over time for millions of years, and we have mistreated them. And all of a sudden, if we learn from nature, we can make and improved not only our way of life, but ensuring that we have viability in the long term. The Amazon being a perfect example where without the Andes, without the sediments that come from the Andes, without the water that comes from the Andes, you wouldn't have such a rich system that then goes back and evaporates and comes and lands in the Andes. And of course, feeds not only to the Atlantic side, but also to the Pacific side. So it's an incredibly amazing and I think, I get emotional about it because it's just such a perfect system with an incredible beauty, right? With an incredible beauty that I've tried to highlight today. And I think if we can really go across sectors and get these conversations going, which are not based on, health, with these siloed approaches, I think we can find some real powerful solutions. So thank you very much.
So thank you to the three speakers. So I had sort of siloed them as Dick talking about engineering and water supply and urban issues, and Heather talking about demand and economics and efficiency and institutions, and Marta talking about ecology. But all three of the speakers are saying the same thing. They're all saying that we need a fundamental rethinking about water, that water is connected to all of the things we care about, from food, ecosystems, to human health, to ecological health, to conflict, to climate change. And that the traditional way we've thought about water in the 20th century, as Heather said, brought enormous benefits to us, but it's the 21st century and it hasn't solved all of our water problems. And we need a more integrated approach. We need to think about new supply, but there are fundamental limits to our ability to take more water out of the system as populations grow. We need technology development and deployment. We need new financial strategies, and each of them talked a little bit about financial strategies with some great examples just now from Marta about the utilities in Quito and Lima setting aside a little bit of money for watershed protection. And that's something maybe our utilities in the United States ought to be thinking about the need for institutional restructuring, about the need for new regulation. And I had sort of questions I could ask Dick to talk about. Where might regulations be appropriate in helping rethink urban supply? Or I could ask Heather to talk about institutional restructuring and getting electric utilities and water utilities to talk together, or getting the water utilities to think more about watershed protection. I could ask Marta to talk about communications and education. But I said at the beginning, we're going to go a little bit past noon. What I'd like to do is get a conversation going and have the audience ask questions. Do we have a microphone? No, we don't. All right, so what I'm going to ask is you to ask questions of any of our speakers, and we'll get a conversation going. I'll repeat the questions, and maybe we have people either online or potentially recorded to hear later to come up and talk to answer some of the questions, and we'll go for about probably 15 more minutes, and then I'll let you go to lunch. So anyone, if you have a question, introduce yourself and ask a question, and then we'll go on from there. So don't.
Should we bring the chairs up for the speakers?
Yeah, why don't we do that, and then they can jump up and come to the microphone. But if I could get Marta and Dick and Heather to come up. So, do we have a question to start? Yeah.
I'll just start, and I'm not sure who I'm asking it to. It seems to me that one of the strongest ecological cases we can make for water is on the watershed. The challenges that I face in low-income countries are two issues. Number one is the disconnect in the political authority between municipalities and the watershed, and the other sense of not concerning about how much water then exits. And so the downstream effect on the ecology gets consistently undervalued. That it doesn't capture it in this sort of neat way that if we can get a little more enlightened, we can take care of the watershed. And I just wonder what thoughts are about how we consider the political economy tensions of this devaluation of the downstream.
Yeah.
So actually, I know it's inconvenient, but
did you capture that? I don't know. So I think that it comes to the other big issue, which is the governance, right? And if there's a sector that is complicated, siloed, and dysfunctional, is the water management sector. But I do think that what is powerful that the sector has put out, and I think most water managers will not negate, is that watersheds should be the unit of analysis and the unit of land use planning. And now we're very far, the intention is there. We're very far away from applying it. You know, I highlight one of the cases is Colombia, for example, when the environmental law was established, the Ministry of Environment, the hope was that the whole country was going to be designed around watersheds. And in the end, they ended up doing the environmental authorities on administrative division. So they've created hell. Like, it's a major conflict in many places. So anyways, but I think in general, there's an understanding and there's an intention there. As we get, what I think is powerful when we think about the drinking water sector is that everyone deep down defends their water. It's a basic thing that cuts across all lines. So there's a way of getting that conversation that I think you don't get with the other sectors. Energy is just more diffuse and agriculture is more complicated. But ideally, when you start looking at sort of the water system for a city, your unit of analysis, and then you start sort of going beyond that. Where is that water that feeds the system? Where is that river that drains the system? And begin to sort of expand from there. At least in my work, I've decided to focus it that way because it's more manageable, less decision makers, less complexity, and then begin to work from there. Once we've had this basic kind of critical mass in that space, I think it's where you can pull out and get to the conversations of the larger watershed. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, even in developing countries. And I highlighted two cases with the intention of saying it doesn't entail a lot of money. A lot of it is just beginning to create collaboration at all levels, whether it's one micro watershed or whether they're larger watersheds. Lima being probably the most problematic watershed in the world.
I'm afraid your engineer's going to have to say
No, Dick, I was hoping you would weigh in on this. And can you talk a little bit about the extent to which, in the work you're doing on rethinking urban systems, the way ecosystems might be being brought in, where either reducing demand on water can help restore ecosystems upstream, or restore urban ecosystems? And maybe that's something that you thought about.
Well, I've thought about it. The problem is we really don't have good examples. When I say that a city like Los Angeles would reduce its need for imported water by half, that's great. Now, where does that saved water go? Or if in the Bay Area we reduce our need for imported water, as we do, or we're trying to do, where does that water go? In my mind, I think what it does, it would leave more water for the Tuolumne River, say. And that's something, there's a big debate ongoing in real time here about how much water should be reserved for the Tuolumne River. And Felicia Marcus, the last chair of the state water board, I think it's fair to say was probably pushed out of office because of her belief that maybe for that river, half for ecosystems, half for cities. And cities think, wow, or ag thought, well, that was way too much. But I think we need to really work on this about finding good examples where if I save all this water, I'm implicit in that is I'm putting that water to better use somewhere else. And because the way the state's plumbed, we can actually do it. But we don't have good examples of that. So I guess that was, so Steve, it's not just developing countries, it's here. And where can we show these benefit to ecosystems?
So what I'd like to do is actually take two questions and then we can combine answers. So there's one here.
Am I heard? So that you're talking louder?
Speak loud. Yeah.
Constantinos Makris from Cyprus University of Technology. I have two related questions to the panelists. The first one has to do with the question of how these new technologies that target wastewater or stormwater actually are at the stage that can safeguard public health. So this is of very high importance to me because we really need not to experiment with people. We need to make sure that any new technology we already have lots of lessons from the field that with negative results, and we have to be very careful before we actually widespread to implement such technologies, even in a city like LA, for example.
Okay.
The second question I have, it has to do with infrastructure, the drinking water infrastructure in cities, which is aging. We all know it's aging infrastructure, and we need to pay more attention to this fact and how it affects quantity, losses of water that can be substantial, and quality issues within the distribution systems by placing more emphasis at the top. We need to ensure that quality tests take place at the top of the consumer, because that's where people are actually exposed to any possible contaminants in water. So I would like
Very
to
good. So just to get it on the recording, two questions, both sort of related to water quality, but one is, as we rethink wastewater reuse, treatment and reuse, stormwater capture, making sure we think about the public health issues associated with contaminants. And Dick mentioned it a little bit in his talk, and maybe we can come back to it. And broadly, as we think about aging infrastructure in places where we built water systems, it's not just new cities and it's old cities and new cities, which came up in the plenary earlier yesterday. As we redesign these systems, can we think about protecting water quality at the very beginning, at the very top of the system? And then there was another question here.
Yes, so this Wendy Bennett. I'm very involved with the Nature Conservancy as a trustee, and both in some of their work in very remote areas of Africa, but also in the U.S. and in Minnesota. So it's about water quality, nutrients in the water, farming, et cetera. But also wearing my hat with American Public Media, where I'm helping them with the water project. So how much should we be engaging the public? How much, in some of these projects that we're working in Lake Tanganyika, I mean, we're really spending a lot of effort educating people about how you keep your water clean and what are the different effects to, how you're using the water, what does it all mean? In the US, we have these huge barriers. People know nothing about their water and how it comes out of the tap, and they don't care, and no one's ever told them that they should care, and they're only aware of it around droughts. So I have this instinct that says that we shouldn't distance it. We shouldn't have to sell a water project as a beach, keep your beach looking nicer, you're gonna have a local park. We should be telling people about water in their lives and what it takes to bring water that's clean to them, and the public health risks. So I'd be interested to know, because we're gonna have to build a lot of public will to get public money flowing at a higher rate to keep up with it. So I would love your experience.
That's a great question. So again, just quickly, the question more clearly stated by Wendy than me is basically how do we engage the public, which doesn't know much about water? They know it rains over here and water comes out their faucet, but almost nobody knows what's going on in between. And yet deep down, we know people care about water. How can we engage the public from an education point of view and from a public participation point of view and a commitment point of view to get some of these solutions more effective and more implemented more effectively? So, and who would like to tackle those questions?
I can say something.
Dick, why don't you start?
Sure. I'll use the example of stormwater, and I guess I take a little bit of a different view. We really do have to engage the public, and that in Los Angeles City and County last fall, they passed Measure W, which was a stormwater parcel tax to pay for stormwater capture and supply. And it was largely sold on this idea of protect our beaches. Now, Southern California is a little different than up here. The people go out into the beaches and stuff like that. Well, they have regular beach closings down there. And so when you talk about stormwater, which could be something in the abstract, but if you say, we need more resilient water supply, and we're also going to protect our beaches, and we're going to green the city environment, and it's a source of water that's not imported, and we don't have to go to desalination, then that brings in so many groups that things get done. And in that case, it was passing a parcel tax. So education is really important, but I will go back again to the idea of the co-benefits. If it's a single issue thing, it's hard to get a coalition of the willing. And you need the surf riders, you need the Sierra Club, you need the Audubon Society, you need the tree people, you need the Council for Watershed Health. You get all of them on your side, and then it's done. Well, not quite done, but you know what I mean. So that's my experience. Oh, did I say I skipped technology? Oh, on the reuse. Let's. I talked about the example for LA, big centralized reuse. Then we can go to decentralized systems. How small should we go for the reuse? I think we should go no smaller than a system in which you can afford to pay someone to oversee it. That's it. And so that takes us down, I think, to the scale of Facebook or something like that. For an individual homeowner, maybe if you're a fanatic, you might do something. But for the average homeowner, I think there's probably too much risk, too much public health risk. So you got to have, Peter, you have to have a grown up in charge, I'm afraid.
Okay. Heather?
Yeah.
I'll add on a couple of those things on the water quality and water reuse. And I'll speak a lot to California. That's what I'm most familiar with when it comes to that. The state does have standards around water reuse, particularly for non-potable reuse, so using it for irrigation or other non-drinking water, and has recently developed regulations around has also had for indirect potable reuse. So where you're putting it in, recharging groundwater, for example, and taking it out. Where they're now trying to focus on is direct potable reuse. So what are the regulations? What are the protections and safeguards needed there? And I think we have examples, and Namibia obviously has been doing it for 40, 50 years. I think regulators in California are getting more comfortable with the idea and will soon be passing some regulations around that. I do think that technology does a good job, and it's possible. I also, though, think we need to think about source control as well and be conscious of the chemicals that we're putting in the environment. There are questions around emerging contaminants, and we need to be controlling those so that it's not really just the responsibility of the technology to clean it up, but that we're not putting it in the system in the first place. And that links to this question of education. So there's an education around that, but I wholeheartedly think we need to be bringing people in around water, and it may look different. I think people care about different issues. As you mentioned, in Southern California, for some, it's beach quality and water quality there, and so I think we have to meet people where they're at, and find what sort of moves and motivates them and connect water to it. I think the good news is water is connected to pretty much everything we care about. So it's not difficult, but I think we need to do it. And I think, many water utilities have been separate from the public, and they've sort of liked that. They've been below the radar, and when the drought came, I think many were nervous about being looked at, looking at their water use, looking at their efficiency, and so there is still pushback. I think you hear from utilities, they don't want to share data, but the more progressive ones, I think, are moving forward on that. I think they are trying to communicate with their public about how they're using water and what it takes and what the risks are, because those are the folks that are going to have to pay for it. And I think Dick's point is a great one about the idea of demonstrating the co-benefits, because that's how you are going to sell these projects to the public, to decision makers. It's also how you might be able to secure additional funding. There's co-financing opportunities, and that's a huge motivator, because we are faced with limited budgets in many cases. That's just the reality.
Thank you. Martha? Last comment?
Yeah, I have an anecdote that I think highlights the situation, Constantinos, with, for example, in the case of Ecuador, my water source and me that works in water with the water company had higher arsenic than the standard allowed. And this became a huge scandal in the city, and I was shocked. These were my friends. I talked to them all the time, and they were giving me water with higher arsenic than it should. It's naturally occurring arsenic. So it's something I didn't know about, but it happens in the Himalayas and the Andes, and it's something that needs to be managed by the companies. And basically, they diluted it, and now the problem is solved. So, of course, what did I do? I go out and buy a reverse osmosis filter, and because I can afford it. But the rest of the people, it's like, so it's this notion of We need to get those conversations about water literacy down to, it's part of our health. It's part of something that I think is really important. I think mentioning that you work with the Nature Conservancy, Brian Richter's book, he highlights how everybody should be basically literate in water. And one of the questions that I made was, where does your water come from? You know where your energy might come, you know where your cell phone or your computer. Shouldn't you know who the company is behind your water, right? And many of these companies are public companies, right? They're supposed to be responding to the consumers of a particular community. So they really are public servants. So I really think it's very important. As you all know, in Latin America, there were major scandals when some of the water companies were privatized. And it was because there was a lack of transparency about cost. If you increase the rate, what does that mean? Where is that money going to be spent? And what return are the customers going to get? People are willing to pay more if they see the benefit. So I think it is a complicated conversation, but I think the most transparency that we can give to the system, it will improve the system. It will generate new ideas about, you know, how we can do things better. And in addition to that, I think it's going to ensure viability in the long run to begin to go towards total cost accounting. Water is too cheap for everyone. We need to make sure we address the pricing issue. And in many countries, they tell me, no, you can't. I think you can. Even in very poor communities, start with 1 cent. Build over time. You can't do it over time, you know, in one shot like they did in Cochabamba or whatever. But we need to pay for the real cost of water. So I think that's, you know, your question touches on a nerve that's really key.
Okay, thank you. We could go on forever, of course. As you know, all of you know, because you're here, water is critical to this broad issue of planetary health. It's complicated, but it's tied to everything we care about. The good news is, despite the bad news, there are innovative solutions going on all over the world, in communities, in utilities, in the private sector, in public organizations, that show the way, in my opinion, to a more sustainable water future that ties these things together. We got a little bit of that today. It's just the beginning of the conversation. I don't want to keep you from lunch, but I'd like you to join me in thanking the panelists. And hopefully we can continue the conversation moving forward. Thank you very much.